This is part of a series that has been run by Engineering New Zealand. It is the third webinar that's been held so far. The first was an intro to the series. My name is Jeanette Ward. I am chair of the Transportation Group National Committee, and I am joined today by Glen, Koorey and Bridget, who are also on the National Committee. We have teamed up to bring you this webinar today. Just a little bit about the Transportation Group. We are an industry technical group of Engineering New Zealand, and we have around 1,000 members. We hold branch events around the country and also an annual conference, and we also have a publication that comes out every 3 months. We do have subgroups as well that focus on traffic signals, transport modelling, and also a group that maintains a database on parking and trip data. If you want to join us, please go to our website, which is transportationgroup.nz. So today we're going to start with a brief discussion about what is a failure, and then some introduction to today's focus, which is road safety. I will then look at how we measure and report and assess road safety, and then Glen will look at some potential issues with what we measure and discuss some other possible ways to do things. Then Bridget will discuss the associated systemic industry processes and constraints. This should take around 30 minutes, and then we will open up for a discussion by answering as many questions as we can today. So one definition of a failure is a lack of success. In transport terms, we've tried to look at some types of failures which we might see in our industry. Transport is quite different from other engineering disciplines. Other webinars in this series will be looking at specific projects where a failure has occurred. Maybe a structural failure, a failure that is actually quite obvious. So in our industry, we might see projects where the objectives haven't been met. Or we might see projects where the objectives have been met, but we've had some undesirable side effects. And also, what about inappropriate objectives? And then lastly, we can actually design some failures into our system as well if we want to minimise harm. So these are the things we will try and grapple with today. And we'll just have now a look at what these failures, what form they could take. So transport project failures can take many forms. There could be a loss of life or serious injury. And traditionally, a loss of time compared to the travel time savings expected could be a failure if that was an objective. There may also be a loss of property or damage to property, or loss of normal services, levels of service if that was an objective, and noting that this could apply across a range of modes. There will be other forms of failure, so maybe have a think about that and what you've experienced, and please add that to the question area, just as a point you might like to make. So, moving on to today's focus. We thought that road safety was a key area to talk about. Although we don't have one-off failures that can kill or harm people in one go, in our sector we have the issue of, on average, one person is being killed every day in New Zealand on the roads, and another 7 are being seriously injured. This is a failure. Deaths or serious injuries should not be an inevitable cost of travelling. The Road to Zero strategy, released in 2019, sets out our vision for a New Zealand where no one is killed or seriously injured in road crashes. This image from the Road to Zero strategy outlines the vision at the core of the strategy with 7 guiding principles and 5 focus areas. These focus areas are vehicle safety, work-related road safety, road user choices, system management, and infrastructure improvements and speed management. So this just helps to set some context for the rest of our discussion today. In terms of measuring and assessing road safety, we have a range of key databases available to us. These being the crashes that occur if they are attended by police. So these are stored in the Waka Kotahi crash system, crash analysis system, also known as CAS. Then we also have access to things like hospital admissions and also ACC data. The Ministry of Transport undertake and publish annual crash records with a range of statistics, such as shown here, where the casualties are shown by road user type. Road controlling authorities also report on road safety using the above data sets in a way that works for their jurisdiction. Here is an example of a couple of bicycle crash data reports. We have annual deaths over time, and on the right there are cycle crashes by intersection type. So these are just examples of how you can use that data. Here's another one where crash factors recorded in CAS can also be reported. This example shows the 10 most frequent pedestrian factors contributing to a fatal crash. Reporting could also be based on location and severity, as shown here for pedestrian crashes. You will have seen graphs like this a lot through your work, and you may produce them yourselves. Deaths and injuries by risk could also be reported. This uses the Household Travel Survey results for hours spent travelling. But just noting that cyclist and pedestrian risk is actually a bit higher, because the Household Travel Survey underestimates the amount of cycling and walking. It sometimes can overlook many of our recreational cycle trips. We could also report the number of vehicles involved in a fatality. So this little matrix here is quite a useful way to see the number of or the interactions between various types of vehicle. And as you can see there, car to car is one of the highest incidences involving fatalities. So just note, there are always limitations and sometimes disparity between the data sets. Here's an example from some work Glen recently undertook, where he looked at vulnerable transport users' serious injury data, and he looked at the CAS data and the hospital data. And it was found that there was underreporting to the police and also that non-motor vehicle injuries weren't captured in CAS. So just finally, before I hand over to Glen, I'd just like to talk about the types of assessments that we make before projects are built and also sometimes after they're built. So as we work through a project, the most kind of important internal process we undertake is doing some internal peer reviews and looking at what we are doing, what our peers are doing. And these should be very common. We also have road safety audits, which are very common, and generally these are done at concept, detailed design and post-construction stages. And this is an opportunity to pick up any issues. Safe system assessments are currently less common than road safety audits, but offer another way to look at a scheme, and these will become more common in the future. There are also other things like non-motorised user audits. There's also other kind of, I guess, outside of our industry, looking at things like SEPTED, that today we'll just focus on road safety. But just have a think about what else could we do? What are the things that you think could be done to improve the way we assess road safety? So, Glen, I'm going to hand over to you now to have a discussion around the potential issues with what we measure and other possible objectives.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeanette. So, next thing that we want to look at is the potential that what we're measuring, some of those data sources that you just saw that Jeanette showed up there, are not necessarily the ones that we actually want to focus on. There may be quite a range of other possible objectives rather than just the numbers of road deaths and injuries to focus on why we should prioritise a certain project, for example. And there's a range of other transport objectives we may want to consider, for example, things to do with environmental sustainability, access to a range of people, public health and well-being, economy, etc., etc. And we're starting to see this reflected also in national policy statements as well. So, for example, this diagram here is from the Transport Outcome Frameworks that the Ministry of Transport developed a few years ago. And so it highlighted that a good transport system should be meeting a range of objectives. So yes, safety is one of them. You'll see there's healthy and safe people as one of the strands. But there's also things like inclusive access, economic prosperity, resilience and security, and environmental and sustainability as well. And so a good project, a good transport system should be aiming to achieve all those. And so you may need to be thinking about what else you're balancing when you're doing a safety project. And I want to just go through a few examples of how that may identify a few conflicts in how we currently assess things. So a classic one is looking at the difference in terms of health versus safety. And active modes are a very common situation where we see this conflict. So we've probably for at least the last decade identified the value of encouraging more walking and cycling and other active modes, and we want to encourage that take up, and we're seeing a lot more rolling out of infrastructure and strategies and promotion in those spaces. But the problem is that if we see more walking and cycling happening, the basic rules of exposure times likelihood typically means we're probably going to see more deaths and injuries in those modes unless we can greatly improve the relative safety of what we're providing. And so this is a challenge. How do we reconcile this if we may have possibly our strategies have objectives for increasing use and take-up of these modes, but also have objectives in reducing the numbers of deaths and injuries in this space as well. And traditionally, this has been a bit of a problem, and often has been sort of taken to the lowest common denominator of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't encourage these modes. If we had fewer people walking and cycling, that would solve the problem. We would have fewer deaths and injuries from these modes. And that's a very classic way of looking at the numbers and saying, well, there's your solution. But the thing it doesn't really do is recognise the health benefits. And we're recognising increasingly in the last decade or two that the health benefits far outweigh the safety losses that might be achieved at the same time as well. And when we're looking at that whole transport system, the health benefits come into play quite a lot. So just as an example of this, there was a bit of research done about 10 years ago by Graham Lindsay and Alex McMillan and Alistair Woodward, and they looked at this question of what would happen if you shifted 5% of the urban vehicle kilometres in New Zealand from motor vehicles to cycling. They did a model to work out the implications of that. Not surprisingly, they found that you would get this exposure effect of having a few more cycle fatalities a year, so estimated an additional 5 cycle fatalities per year. But at the same time, you would get much fewer deaths due to increased physical activity, and also a bit due to vehicle emissions as well, reduced vehicle emissions. So if you look at the bigger picture, you can see that there has been a net gain in terms of total mortality as a result of getting more people cycling. And that's kind of the key pictures we have to appreciate, is get that bigger picture understanding that doing things like this, encouraging more active modes, there may be a few trade-offs, but the bigger picture is you're actually going to get improved outcomes in terms of the overall safety, the whole of life safety of people. Another classic one is the trade-offs between safety versus efficiency, and this has been very common for a number of years in New Zealand, to basically look and say, well, we'd like to slow down traffic, for example. That's very good for reducing the severity of injuries. But slowing down traffic is bad in terms of travel times as well. And certainly historically we've seen many safety projects, say introducing a new crossing, for example, a signalised crossing or something, rejected because it will have too much of an impact on the travel times at the same time. And so how do we resolve this dilemma here? And there's a couple of things that we're starting to do a lot better in New Zealand that I think start to take that into account. One of the first ones is that we're starting to recognise that the existing travel speeds on our network are actually not necessarily the most safe and appropriate speeds as well. A number of you will be familiar with the new setting speed limits process in New Zealand, the use of tools like mega maps to identify what are appropriate speeds. And so it may be that in introducing some new safety facility, you are slowing down the traffic, but you're actually getting that traffic speed to head closer to the safe and appropriate speed that you're after anyway. So that's actually a good thing, that you are slowing down the traffic, and we should recognise that as a benefit, not a disbenefit. The other thing is to consider context as well, and there are some locations, particularly minor local streets, where thoroughfare is not really the key metric, where it shouldn't really matter what the effects are on travel times. That's not the purpose of those roads, that's not the function of them, and we want to focus on safety in those locations, and we don't really care if some traffic has to get held up a little bit, because they probably shouldn't be there most of the time anyway. So we're starting to see some changes in our approaches to safety versus efficiency as well. The third one I'd like to look at is this whole question of safety versus danger. And historically, we often look at numbers like the ones that Jeanette showed earlier and prioritise in terms of how many crashes, how many injuries did we see, and the ones with the most tend to be the ones that rise to the top of our priority list. The problem is that we may have situations where no one's actually really using a certain facility because they deem it as too dangerous. So how do you measure that latent demand of people who would like to use it but aren't there? This picture here just on the slide shows a classic one we see in many places in New Zealand, a multi-lane roundabout, and there's a pedestrian trying to contemplate how they're going to get across those two lanes of approaching traffic to carry on their way. And it's often very difficult in a situation like this to do it safely, and not surprisingly, a lot of pedestrians and cyclists, for example, will not necessarily want to do that. And so they won't use the trip, they won't make the trip, they won't have the potential exposure to actually having a crash at that location. So we need to think of other ways to somehow capture that information and recognise the dangerous places that aren't being shown up in terms of the crash numbers. That could be as simple as feedback from local individuals, seeing what they think. We could use some kind of the review and audit methods that Jeanette talked about before. Things like safe system assessment can be quite good at highlighting where you are failing on certain metrics, for example. And we also have crash prediction models can be quite good at proactively flagging sites. We don't need to necessarily wait for some crashes to happen to illustrate that actually the design is dangerous in some way as well. So just thinking about our discussion later on, I guess the question we'd like you to think about is how much we should focus on some of those metrics like crash and injury numbers versus how much we should focus perhaps on some of those other ways that we might be assessing the objectives of a transport project as well. And now I will hand over to Bridget to finalise the discussion.
Thank you, Glen and Jeanette. Kia ora tātou. Thank you all for being here. We're very intimidated by the fact that there's 150 of you, but also it's great because it means that there's a lot of interest in this topic. We think that road safety is really hard but really urgent. It's a challenge that we want to look at a big picture level, and as engineers, transportation group isn't only for engineers, but a lot of us, Jeanette and Glen and I certainly have engineering backgrounds. We do tend to focus on detail and design decisions and constraints and minimising things to a specific issue and intentionally drawing a ring around that. Whereas for a problem like road safety, as Glen and Jeanette have alluded to, it's actually really complex, and when you make assumptions that something is not relevant, then you're ignoring a big part of the question and the problem, which is why we're in this mess, that we still have somebody dying every day on our streets and we're not really sure what to do about it. And I don't think internationally anybody has really got it sussed, except perhaps the Dutch, but we might get to that shortly. So when we think about transport and road safety, there are a whole lot of industry processes and constraints that we need to deal with, and we need to understand complexity at quite a big picture level before we can go and unpack those and tackle them. So what I mean by that is that we have research, policy, planning, design, construction, monitoring all shown in this diagram. If we focus, for example, just on design, then we're missing the question of, well, why are we designing this particular project in the first place? If we focus just on the crash numbers, as Glen has said, then we're not seeing the other parts of the policy that these decisions might be affecting. So it's important to have people who are working across different aspects of the system and not just pigeonholed into one of them, because then you might be able to fix one specific intersection or make it slightly better, ignoring the processes that led to that site not being very safe to start with. So perhaps with that in mind, we might be able to think about reducing harm by looking at different measures and therefore introducing different feedback loops in the system. So what do I mean by that? At the moment, we have this system where crash data, or at least the reported crash data, informs research, and we have crash prediction models based on how many crashes you might expect for a given intersection, for example, with given traffic flows and approaches. As Glen has said, that ignores the fact that we might have pedestrians, school-age pedestrians, for example, not crossing the road because their parents won't let them because it's too dangerous. So all of a sudden we've got an inbuilt bias into every other part of this system, what we're designing, what those crash prediction models say, and therefore who we're ignoring. So all of us have examples where people have said, we don't need a crossing here, there's no pedestrians, which is a really unfortunate but common statement that is undermining all of our efforts to do anything about health or climate change or inclusion or equity. So we build on these crash prediction models. We have national crash numbers, and we're all very familiar with crash data. It informs priorities at every council decision-making table around where they're going to upgrade the next intersection or corridor or what project they're going to do. And quite often in vehicle design and technical specifications, the crash outcomes will inform design standards, so at least those written guidelines are a best practice in terms of what we know about how crashes happen. But we're still locked in this cycle of only using the data that we are used to using. What that means, for example, and there's lots more examples beyond these, but this is the kind of thing we're interested in discussing with you shortly. The data that we use in road safety is crash data. It gives us very few links between transport and health. It doesn't incorporate exposure for walking and cycling, because we know that people choose different walking and cycling trips based on how safe they feel. That's particularly important for women, particularly important for parents who are deciding whether or not their child can walk or bike to school and what route they will take. What that means is that we have quite a high number of people not using those walking and cycling modes, or not making the trip at all because they don't feel safe doing so. Another implication of that is that we don't have combined budgets across transport and health for recreational trips. So in lockdown, when we were all walking around the block once a day because we felt like we should, the transport sector doesn't really care about those trips because they are A to A. The origin and the destination are the same, and you're literally going nowhere. But we all know increasingly now how important those trips are, walking and cycling in fresh air, for our mental and physical health. So perhaps we need to introduce some kind of joined up ministry group across transport and health to look at this kind of investment. Because if somebody is jogging around the block and they cross the road and hurt themselves, that suddenly becomes a transport sector problem. So as Glen has alluded to as well, it's hard to prioritise for walking and cycling improvements without the numbers of people that we might expect to see, especially when we're introducing it bit by bit and we do a piecemeal bit of nice cycleway somewhere. Well, a nice cycleway that's 1 mile from my house is no good for my 12-year-old son, because how is he supposed to get there? So then politicians can point at that and say, see, that didn't do anything. We need much more comprehensive data and investment stories to help build up the networks from the inside out, so that we can see those growing numbers of trips and therefore measure the health and other benefits that we know will come. We think, well, I think, measures such as travel time savings for people in cars are widespread and powerful and biased and unfair. And actually, when we're talking about people not able to walk and cycle because it's too dangerous, why are we even thinking about a 3-second travel time saving for someone who is already getting there in their car anyway? Why are we trading those things off as though they were equal? And then we hardly ever go back to check whether those promised travel time savings were achieved. We know that widening streets and adding capacity generates its own car traffic, so often they're not achieved, and they also have a vicious cycle effect where the increase in traffic creates even more of a severance effect, putting people off walking and cycling across the road. So I think now what we're going to do is to, now that we've loaded all that on you, to open it up to conversation. I can see that there are some questions coming through here. So Jeanette is going to convene this session, and we will have a nice conversation, I think.
So Bridget, you might want to flick to the next slide, because we also posed some questions.
Yeah, so yeah, we can see what questions people put up themselves, but these are some options. We've got half an hour to talk about this, but all of us three are involved in the Transportation Group's National Committee, and don't worry if we don't get to your specific question, because we're keen for this to be the start of a more serious conversation within our sector about what we do about some of this stuff. So we are going to continue and have some more conversations, and these are just some examples of what we thought you might want to discuss.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions here, I think for you, Glen, in relation to your content. So someone has asked, is the reduction of death in cars due to mode shift incorporated in the 5 extra deaths on bikes?
Yeah, I actually went and had a look at the paper just to have a check and see whether it captured that, and I don't know whether it has. So interestingly, I think you could argue there's another benefit that isn't even represented as well, is that there may be a further reduction in motor vehicle deaths and injuries as well, because there's fewer people driving. It's a bit tricky though, because sometimes that less traffic means everyone goes a bit faster and the severity goes up as well. So, but yeah, I could imagine that's another win-win out of a policy change like that as well.
Okay, we have another one here around when we signalise intersections, I assume the person means, could we prioritise locations which have higher crash rates, so it would not affect total cost even if it increases travel time cost?
Yeah, I guess so. We tend to trade off a bit that sometimes it's the sites with more absolute crash numbers, and sometimes it's the sites with the higher crash rates. Because they, we want to tackle the dangerous sites, but we also want to tackle the sites that are clearly killing and injuring a lot of people the most. So that prioritisation is always a tricky balance there. In terms of costs overall, again, it comes back to the question of whether we think it's an important factor, how much we value the travel time.
Okay, there's a couple here, Bridget, that are, I guess, related to human behaviour or human factors. That might be a good one for you. So, do you consider that longer travel times can lead to more impatient drivers and thus an increased chance of accidents through possible increased risk-taking to make up time?
No, I think that argument can get in the bin. I think that the whole thing about travel times is that we're so focused on it and we're so used to worrying about it that we make up reasons why it's important. And certainly that argument has been used to justify rural passing lanes, for example, that we put in a passing lane and we have this frustration benefit because these angry drivers are relieved of their frustration. And what have we found with rural passing lanes? That they're so angry and competitive they crash at the merge anyway, and we don't necessarily see that benefit. So the problem with using travel time savings to justify more capacity is that it generates more traffic. And therefore you're not going to relieve that frustration anyway, because there's going to be more traffic and everybody is being implicitly told that driving is the way to go. So and it might be drivers do get frustrated sitting in traffic, but that's because driving a car is a very inefficient way to move around. So we need to give them alternatives where it's nice and easy and enjoyable actually. And we know that the happiest commuters are people who walk and bike, and that includes the walking and biking legs that you might do as part of a public transport journey. So we need to build those efficiencies into our priorities so that we get nice, happy, safe and mobile people, not just angry drivers, and trying to make them slightly less angry.
I would just add too that you tend to get a reduced mean speed, So that the overall population, you reduce the likelihood of crashes, and when you do have crashes, the severity is less on average. So the odd impatient driver is far outweighed by the ones who are travelling much safer.
Okay, thanks, Bridget and Glen. I'm not sure if this is a question or a statement, but when road speed is increasingly prescriptive, this is an 80k road regardless of weather or visibility, then it discourages driver responsibility, i.e. This is a 100k road, but anything over 75 is far too dangerous.
I think that might be alluding to the idea that before about a decade ago, then we had these pretty ubiquitous 50k urban streets and 100k rural roads, and everybody knows that you can't drive 100 kilometres an hour around the Coromandel, for example. Whereas if we set a speed limit at 80 or 60, then perhaps that's more of a message to people that that's a target. I think overall the benefits outweigh the risks in terms of using speed limits for speed management, because you're going to reduce the average speed, reduce the 85th percentile speed, and therefore reduce the crash rate, even if there are some people who might argue that somehow they're going faster than they would have with a 100k limit. The data pretty clearly shows that if you reduce the speed limit, then there's pretty much always some kind of reduction in speed, and there's always, as far as I've seen, an improvement in safety. So, yeah, I don't think that's a particularly valid argument.
Okay, here's quite a, I guess, common question we've had over the last 2 years since the Road to Zero strategy was released, but this person has noted that given motorised transportation is a dangerous task as it is, and human error is inevitable, might Road to Zero be a misleading goal? And I've heard many people saying this, but I think that from my perspective, you've got to aim for what you want. You've got to aim high. If we try and put in numbers and try and work towards lower numbers, is that really going to give us enough drive to achieve what we want to do?
Well, certainly the countries that have implemented it the best with good policies and prioritisation around that Vision Zero, they've done the best in terms of reducing trauma. So, yeah, I agree with you, Jeanette. I think you can argue, and people do, about the ethics of saying we're not going to kill anyone on the road and how much investment you therefore put into that versus promoting health supporting activities. But yeah, most of the transport sector, certainly the themes from our conferences over the last few years, generally very supportive of Vision Zero because they can see how it brings the community with us to support these road safety investments.
There's an analogy with workplace safety, and again we try and focus on saying, well, we don't want anyone killed in workplace situations, and a lot of those are very dangerous tasks as well, and human error is inevitable in those as well. And I think we've got to appreciate that human crashes may still be inevitable because of that human error. That doesn't mean the deaths and injuries that go with it need to be inevitable as well if we put the safe systems in place.
Okay, we've got a question here which must relate to something Bridget was talking about, but I'm not exactly sure. So the question is, this seems to be an overlooked aspect of road safety. So this is from Dale. So Dale, if you want to retype your question about which particular aspect.
To the earlier bit actually, because he had the previous question.
So it could be linked to his first question.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Okay, here is another question. Is it true that second-hand cars are still being imported into the country with low safety star ratings? If so, then why, and how is this situation reconciled with the Vision Zero strategy?
I mean, they are being imported, and there are a lot of challenges with a blanket rule change about vehicle safety standards and imports. We're trying this increasingly. With every refresh of our road safety strategy and government policy statement, there are new interventions to try and encourage higher star ratings of imported vehicles, particularly ones that don't penalise people who can't afford a new car or a really high quality second-hand car, say, because we know that people on the lowest incomes are overrepresented in road trauma. They can't necessarily afford a new vehicle. So the government is trying to improve the standard of the safety of vehicles in the fleet, but that also needs to be balanced with people's need for mobility. And again, it's one of those trade-offs that Glen alluded to, that there is no blanket answer for safety because it doesn't exist in isolation from all of the other constraints and challenges that people have in their lives. And if you live in South Auckland and you work shifts and you have a family of 3 or 4 children that need to get places and you're on a minimum wage, you can't necessarily afford to be picky about the vehicle that you're buying. So it's where government regulation and support and subsidies and all those wraparound processes need to come in to help people to be safe, whether they realise it or not.
Yeah, there's a long tail of older, less safe vehicles already in the system, and that takes a long change. You know, you look at the fleet now, yes, it's immensely better than 10 years ago, which is immensely better than 10 years before that. The only other way, the affordability issue that Bridget alluded to, is whether we start making more use, at least in some places, of car share. So if you want to get more use of better, high standard vehicles, if we change the ownership model so that people are saying, well, actually owning a car is pretty expensive anyway, if I can find a way, a good system that can allow me to just rent one when I need to, that's another possible way to sort of try and get that into the...
Yeah, that's right. And also another link, I talked about links between the transport and health sectors, but the transport and social service sector is a really big gap. We don't have anybody in the Ministry for Social Development who works on transport, and we don't have anybody in transport who works with the Ministry for Social Development. So as well as car share, which sounds like quite, you know, something that we could all think about and use for commuting, for example, what about supporting local community ride share and community transport options, so that if a church has a van, then it's a good quality van, and it might even be an electric car, and we can incorporate some of these standards and support those communities with subsidies again to help keep their people safe and mobile without just parking you know, a loop car down the road, because they won't even know what that is. They're probably a bit put off by it, not big enough for their needs anyway. But working with community is a really huge gap that we have. We tend to shy away and do our little projects in our little offices, and that's because the system is set up to be siloed, as we've alluded to across this talk today.
Okay, here's another question. In processing and interpreting data, do you consider the human error factor? Because sometimes, despite the number of improvements, something could still happen due to human error, and there may be nothing that you can really do about
it. That's a safe system.
Well, yeah, go read my PhD. So the reason that we have crashes is because humans are humans, not because they're especially good or especially bad, but because they're human and things happen. And there are absolutely things that we can do in the system, like we've all talked about: better infrastructure, slower environments, actually less traffic. So we can debate whether cars should be electric or 5-star or 3-star, but a trip not made by a car is the safest for everybody. So if we can divert more of those trips to healthier modes and to have less traffic on our residential and community streets, and, you know, the Waka Kotahi One Network framework, and the way that we're going to looking at communities rather than just roads and corridors is going to be really helpful to think about. Do we even need traffic in this place? Would it actually be more vibrant and more livable and easier for everyone to live their lives if it were harder for cars to be driving around all over the show? So, yeah, it's always human factors, but there's also absolutely infrastructure and system level changes we can make to ensure that or to promote safety for those humans who are rattling around.
I think there's some sort of hope for people say, well, we can have autonomous self-driving vehicles sometime soon. To be honest, I think you're looking a long way away. There's all sorts of not just technical but regulatory and societal issues for making that happen. So there's some pretty neat safety features going into some vehicles which help minimise some of that error, but we've got to think of other ways to do it. As Bridget says, just have less driving in the first place, and think what else we do to the system. Slow everyone down, have protective features in our road networks, things like that.
Bridget, here's one for you. 2 people have asked this question. How did the Dutch sort out their traffic casualties, as you briefly mentioned?
All of these things that we've just said. So the Dutch had a very car-centric country until about the 60s and 70s. They had a massive protest because they didn't think that it was fair for children to be dying on their streets from road safety outcomes. So they began a massive project of road space reallocation and a really tight definitions of what different streets should look like. So it's essentially a version of our One Network framework. They have residential streets which are pretty much shared driveways, and so whereas your typical New Zealand street, like my street I'm at now, like 9 metres wide asphalt, and everyone drives up and down it at the speed that they feel comfortable at, which is like 57 probably. In the Netherlands it would be much narrower, so it's much more efficient. More of that land can be given to housing and to play and recreation and walking and cycling around. So they're permeable environments for walking and cycling, which means that you can have much more efficient public transport connections because more people can get to each public transport stop. And then they can have nice, well-designed freeways, motorways, where they're the highest safety standards and people can drive at speed or travel on those corridors at speed. So they set their priorities. That was the first thing they did. They said that wasn't acceptable for so many people to be dying on the roads. And then they went on about really a human factors-based process to think about how people travel and to make it easy for people to make more healthy choices. So they've got not only a very safe road system, but a very healthy one with the highest rates of cycling, at least, and probably walking as well in the world, along with some other Scandinavian countries.
Actually, it's interesting thinking of the cycling rates. I talked about the sort of health versus safety issue earlier, and if you go to the Netherlands, it's a fantastic place to cycle. The crash rate per kilometre cycled is the lowest in the world. They still have 200 cycling deaths a year, compared with, say, the 10 a year we have in New Zealand. And so, they can't completely get rid of it. It is still a problem they are trying to grapple with. The reason they have that many is simply, though, because they have so much cycling. Compared to us, it's a massive amount more cycling. And they're trying to tackle that. But of course, equally, they will be having huge gains in terms of their health and all those other benefits that will be far outweighing the fact that, unfortunately, some people are still dying while cycling there.
Okay, someone's just added a comment that kind of backs up what we were talking about before in terms of aiming for 0 deaths. Just a statement: if you aim for a half measure, you get nothing. If you aim for the goal, you get something. So thanks for that comment. That's great. Someone here is mentioning that travel planning, and then in brackets certainly in the UK, was a really great way of understanding journeys and routes and that people and students wanted to use. This info was the basis of our Safe Routes to School project. Travel planning in New Zealand seems to be on the periphery. Maybe something I'm missing, but don't think we use that approach enough.
It does seem to have fallen out of favour. So what we mean by travel planning is organisation-based interventions and monitoring to encourage people who go there, whether they're students or staff or whatever, to use modes that aren't single occupancy car. So there'll be things like make sure you've got secure bike parking and showers and lockers, and work with the local council to see about any infrastructure interventions, although that's a bit more rare. I think travel planning is probably going to come back into vogue a bit more now because of our climate change motivations and policies. So I think I agree that it can be really helpful, especially because the point where people join a new workplace, for example, is a big decision point in their life, and they're more likely to consider changing mode when they start a new job than they would have just off the cuff when they've been in the same job for a long time. So they're changing the job, they've got to take a new route anyway, so it's a good time to nudge them towards thinking about a different mode. But travel planning in isolation from all of these infrastructure changes isn't going to be much use, again, especially for women who feel particularly vulnerable cycling in our busy streets. So we need to have that as part of the package, but make sure that we're looking at infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and I think Bridget's dead right, because a lot of organisations are now developing climate change policies and action plans, and travel planning is a bit of a no-brainer in terms of something they can actually do and work on. I think there's a lot of new schools being built around New Zealand, and some of them in quite sort of complex environments, and councils are requiring school travel plans as part of that kind of approvals process, and the schools themselves want to do that as well. So I think we're going to see a lot more school travel planning going on as well. Okay, someone has asked, how about introducing harsh speed humps against vehicle operating costs and comfort?
What's the question? So should we have more speed bumps?
Yeah, and harsh, I guess, in terms
Oh,
of
I see. I mean, I think speed humps have their place, but they have a lot of disadvantages, especially like a bus just went past my window. Bus passengers don't like them. They put people off bus travel when they're done on bus routes. And there are actually kind of more efficient, easier ways. It shouldn't be that we make it difficult for people to choose a safe speed. We don't want to like antagonize drivers for having to go slow. We want to get to the point of the Netherlands where the self-explaining speed is a safe and slow speed, and it's not that you have to use these other harsh treatments. I mean, I'm all for speed bumps a lot of the time, especially in places like car parks, for example, or I think that'd be a good idea at the end of a driveway where you haven't got good visibility so people don't tear out onto the footpath. But in terms of a mass treatment in a lot of places, I think there are things we can do to, again, reduce traffic, to slow it down without necessarily making drivers feel too upset about it. And if you need to have an abrupt speed bump, then it's probably likely to encourage them to speed up again after it anyway, whereas you really want to try and create a whole environment that's operating at a safe and appropriate speed.
Yeah, they can have quite significant noise effects to surrounding neighbours as well. I've seen some pulled out because the adjacent houses just couldn't stand all the bumps of everything going past. So, yeah, I think you've got to look at the other tricks in your toolbox, and that's, you know, your road widths, other methods of road surfacing, your forward sight distances, all those things often have a far bigger effect on what speed people will choose down a street.
Yeah, and they're also not good for emissions because they create this acceleration deceleration, which means cars are going to be emitting more carbon than they otherwise would. But yeah, so in general, use them with caution.
There's been a bit of work recently on not so much the term road humps, but raised safety platforms. Osrose has done some research there, and I know Waka here working on guidance for these, and they've been certainly useful in some situations, particularly on the approach to intersections. So it'll be good to see more of them being rolled out in the appropriate locations. We've got 10 minutes to go, so we'll try and get through these remaining questions. Are there regions in New Zealand that are making more holistic decisions, as we've suggested today, or are our national limitations not allowing this yet?
I'd say Auckland definitely has recognised the impact that they have. You know, they're a big part of the country. They do have a lot of the existing deaths and serious injuries there, and there's been a lot of work happening in the last few years for them to recognise that, develop business case, road safety strategies, and trying to work through that, and continuing to look at things as well, continuing to review and say, are we on the right track, or that's not working, what should we do? So they've certainly been making quite a lot of work there. They went and changed 10% of their speed limits in the last year or so. They recognise that's a big part of it. Other areas, I'd say it varies how much they've recognised that role, and I'd say probably speed limits is one where we see a lot of variation. Some councils have been very good and really sort of cracking on with getting areas lower speeds. Other ones haven't even started, and so we've got to try and get a bit more consistency on that.
Yeah, and I certainly think in terms of the cross-sector collaboration that I was alluding to, if we really want to make big paradigm-shifting gains in road safety, there's nowhere in New Zealand that is doing that. There is no organisation, for example, that has health professionals in council working with the transport planners, or with Ministry for Social Development, as I talked about earlier as well. So it would help all of those councils and authorities that are keen to do more in road safety. It would help their rationale to get more involved with Ministry for the Environment, Ministry of Health and social service sectors, because the outcomes for safety just happens to be really good, inclusive and healthy outcomes as well. So yeah, while they're making various amounts of gains, they're baby step gains, and they've been doing, you know, more or less similar kinds of things over the last 20 years without any real shift. So if this webinar is about lessons learned, it's that if we keep doing the same kind of thing that we've done, then isn't that what Einstein said? Keep doing what you've done, you'll get what you've always got, which is ad hoc improvements, and our graphs kind of not doing much year on year. We either pat ourselves on the back or frown a little bit, and it's really, we haven't done anything that's really different, so I don't know what else we would expect. Yeah, I think, and like I said earlier, I'm keen for more conversation about that. How can we make this more than an Engineering New Zealand transportation group situation, and actually a community and authority and you know, region and citywide interventions?
So Glen mentioned, some councils being quite proactive on the urban speed limit side of things. So QLDC recently reduced all their urban local streets to 40 k's an hour, which leads on nicely to a question here. Do you think the default urban speed limit should be reduced to 40 k's an hour or lower nationally?
I quite like the Swedish approach, where they start with lower default speed limits. Certainly in the rural situation, I believe their default is 70, and then you have to make the case to increase the speed limit. Say, well, this road's got the appropriate protective features, therefore it can be 80, 90, 100, and so forth. And of course, we kind of work the other way around. We start with the 100 and the 50 and say we've got to make the case to make it 40 or 30 or 80, 70, and so forth the other way. So it's a different way of thinking about it. And yeah, I think there's something to be said for the defaults, urban and rural, actually being 40 and 80, simply because when you look at the analysis of most of the roads in New Zealand, they're the two numbers that come up the most as the likely, safe and appropriates. And then you can make the case for whether some can warrant being lower again or possibly higher.
I do think that as transport professionals we over-focus on speed limits, and I think if we're going to, especially in cities like Hamilton where I am, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, Tauranga, Nelson, even growing places, if we've got places that are growing and we've got pressures on housing, we haven't even mentioned that in this conversation, and that's the kind of thinking I think we need to have to actually reclaim some of that land and to do better density so that we get better outcomes across all of these things. And if you do more density and then you narrow the streets to enable that, then you're going to get lower speeds anyway. So yeah, speed limits are a very powerful tool, I've said that already, but I think if we really want to make big gains, especially in growing places where there's construction happening, then we need to capitalise on that in even more clever ways.
Perhaps even also differentiating more. I mean, we've got literally only two categories at the moment, urban and rural, and yet we have a wide range of streets, as Bridget says. We've got streets that are local streets, and we've got arterial streets, and they should have different functions and different defaults, and they should look like they have different functions and defaults as well.
So I guess the things that Bridget's just mentioned about, that holistic approach and looking at land use and transport to work towards, better outcomes is kind of linked to this question here around what policy or decision-making processes would need to change to ensure that safe movement by walking and cycling is prioritised over traffic efficiency and journey times.
Yeah, so we've been thinking about this quite a lot, and I think this alludes back to the travel time savings question. I think, if I haven't said it already, I think we overemphasise travel time savings and vehicle level of service. I don't think that's even a relevant question. We haven't got any national policy for travel time savings. We've got no politician campaigning on travel time savings. Why don't we do all the things that we really want, which is safe, happy, healthy, mobile people, and then the travel speed by car is what it is. We'll be getting better outcomes anyway if we're looking to reduce inefficient transport modes, i.e. sole occupancy car travel, especially in these growing places, and promote the happier, healthier, more efficient, sustainable modes. And to do that, then perhaps we need to look at not incorporating vehicle level of service in our assessments or in our policy language, because it is a big cop-out that puts a roadblock in a lot of good projects. And we'll have council policies saying we want Vision Zero and climate change emergency, and then the transport report says, oh, but the level of service, and the councillors go, oh yeah, good point. Well, it's actually not a good point, and so we should just take that language out.
I'm quite excited by the potential of the Climate Change Commission and the potential objectives from that, because it is serving as a bit of a focus point for people to go, well, how do we achieve that across a number of sectors, including transport? And so that may be a way of focusing the mind there. I highlighted the transport outcomes framework that the MOT already has, and again, that's a good way of seeing that big picture stuff. But I guess I'd caution that any of these things, and councils have got some very good policies and strategies as well, they're only as good as they're being implemented. And we know that often it still falls over when the elected members go, but car parking or travel time or whatever else. We've got to work out how to crack that nut sometimes, the engagement with the elected members and getting the bigger public to understand the issues.
Okay, we've just got a couple more minutes to go. Someone's asked that, walking and cycling is feasible in terms of urban and suburban locations, but what options might be available in rural or semi-rural or rural areas to help, I guess, with your point, Glen, around getting the walking and cycling up to improve overall safety.
I think I've submitted on this kind of thing before, and so in rural areas, again, if you look at it more systematically, we have a lot of pedestrian deaths on rural roads at night time with driver and or pedestrian under the influence of alcohol. And we can look at that problem and say, well, we can have drink drive campaigns, and we can have, guardrails and footpaths to protect people at that crash location. But what about the community transport response to that? What about courtesy shuttles and, again, like car sharing that is owned by that community, where they investigate the whole situation, not just the site where a crash happened where someone was drunk and blamed them or the driver, but to look at the whole fabric of that community and how this person even ended up on that street, how these organisations function, how people get there and get home, and give the community the responsibility and the funding and the support to come up with their own, safer, more environmentally friendly options, because it's, again, I think, another problem of looking at transport in isolation from all the other social and cultural goings-on. I've talked with people who live and work in South Auckland with social service organisations, and they say a lot of people, like Māori people in South Auckland, for example, they need to have a car because they need to get to a tangi that's far away every so often. So it's not as simple as improving walking and cycling options in urban areas, because New Zealanders especially, we don't have very good intercity public transport links, so we need people to have these other more viable options. So rural access is really important, and safety of those modes, and it's not even just for rural people, it's for all of us who go out and visit the countryside from time to time.
Totally agree, and we've rabbited on a bit about speed management as well, and that is a key in urban and rural areas for everyone, all transport users, but certainly walking and cycling. Even in rural areas, yes, ideally we'd like to get down to survivable speeds of 30 k's, 40 k's maybe, but even doing things like reducing, say, existing 100k roads to 80k, getting the speeds to travel down, to slow down, that reduces the likelihood you have those problems in the first case, and it does give people just that bit of extra chance that they might actually survive an impact.
Okay, we've run out of time, so I'm sorry to, I think there's around 6 questions we haven't got to. I will just read out a statement someone's put here, which is quite interesting. Personalised travel planning was also a thing that was undertaken in the UK, and one of the trials over in the UK showed a 11% reduction in congestion, and this would equate to significant safety outcomes as well. So that was just an interesting little study there. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been great to have so many questions come through and have time to answer most of them. We will be preparing a case study kind of compilation to go with this webinar, and that might give us a chance to actually address some of these questions as well, and that will come to you as someone who has registered for the webinar. So thank you very much, and if you want to have a look at what other webinars New Zealand Engineering has in this series, do go and have a look at that on their website. Thank you all, and safe travels.